Thanks very much. I want to get right to it because we're into the afternoon here. We've got a great panel of speakers with some deep experience. To my left, Kevin Wisely, Director of New York State Office of Emergency Management. And next to him, Ira Tannenbaum, Assistant Commissioner of Public-Private Initiatives for New York City Emergency Management Department. And to Ira's left is Elizabeth Greenstein, Chief of Staff of the Mayor's Office of Housing Recovery Operations. And then at the far end is Rich Millet, recently retired Chief Deputy Commissioner of Public Works for Nassau County. He now works in the private sector for the Ardurra Group. So we're going to be focusing on public-private partnerships and how they affect response, recovery, mitigation, and planning. And for the purposes of our conversation today, and so you're not beaten to death with alliteration, we're going to refer to these as P3 initiatives. All right, so I've asked the panel, because they're involved in P3 initiatives, to share with us a particular P3 initiative that they felt was particularly successful, that was rewarding, and may have had some challenges. So I wanted to kind of do this in the order of response, recovery, mitigation, and planning. So I'm going to begin with Ira Tannenbaum.
Alrighty, right into the fire. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. And when I was thinking about talking response and public-private P3s, I'm sorry. The first thing that came to mind is when we do a massive response here in the city, we in New York City Emergency Management run the city's Emergency Operations Center. And our Emergency Operations Center, as you can imagine for New York City, is a large room, 150 seats, that gives us the ability to bring together our partners to make sure that we're speaking in a cohesive way, that we're sharing information. And one of our primary efforts is to make sure that the private sector is involved in that process. In many places across the country, and in fact across the world, you'll find EOCs with city, state, or federal agencies. We created a number of years ago our private sector emergency support function to add right in alongside our public safety emergency support function, our human services support function. We wanted to make sure that our private sector partners are sitting there in the room, hearing the information that we're getting from the National Weather Service or from the incident commanders out in the field, so that they can make decisions and they can make sure that their response in support of the city is ultimately going to be informed by the same information that we're getting. So we did that by partnering with a number of umbrella groups. Obviously, we don't have room in our EOC, as large as it is, for the thousands of individual businesses that are represented here in the city. But ultimately, we were able to partner with organizations such as BOMA, the Building Owners and Managers Association, or SIFMA, Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, to really group by industry some of those key areas so that we can share information and use them as a force multiplier ultimately to make sure that our message and the message coming from City Hall and the mayor is replicated and shared effectively. We saw several instances where that really benefited us, our ability both during Irene as the storm was coming and during Sandy to really get information about what was going on with Con Edison in terms of power, some of those challenges, decisions that organizations and companies were trying to make about how they were going to continue to operate were dependent on some of those key inputs, and we didn't want to wait and get that information and hold it and then put it out a little bit later or bring it over to a different room. We wanted to make sure that they got it at the same time so they can make those decisions during the response phase of any emergency.
All right, thanks, Ira. And Liz, on the recovery side, you've got tremendous experience working with Sandy recovery.
Yeah, so recovery, I think, is the part that's it's the least sexy part of a
Liz, can you
disaster.
pull the mic
Sorry.
forward so everybody can
So
hear?
I think we can probably agree that recovery is the least sexy part of all of this. Everyone wants to get involved with blankets and with mucking out and helping people immediately and during a response. But once you get a year, and now we're 5.5 years out from Sandy, there's a lot of fatigue all around. There's government fatigue, there's donor fatigue, there's nonprofit exhaustion, I would say, not fatigue. Even my own friends, when I tell them what my job is, they like the first sentence is, "What, you're still working on that?" So I think this is the part that, this is really where the program happens. This is where people get made whole, and if we don't focus on recovery in the advanced planning, and then when you get to the actual incident, then I don't want to. As a government official, I can't say that we've failed our constituents, but we have to keep our eyes on the prize, and the prize is getting people back in their homes. I come to this from a strange background, unique to this circumstances. I spent 4 years working as a program officer at a private foundation. I was then director of development at a nonprofit organization. Then I came to the city. I joined Department of Housing Preservation and Development, where my job was public-private partnerships, and now I'm at the Housing Recovery Office. So I have sort of sat in a variety of perspectives on this, but I consider myself a nonprofiteer. And one of the biggest adjustments I had to make coming to the city was not seeing changing my perspective on how work gets done and who your partners are. I think that nonprofits are the bedrock of our communities. They're bedrock of this country, certainly the state and the city, and I can speak really to what's going on in the city. These are the organizations that are on the ground. They've been in these communities for a long time, and they're going to be there for a long time. They have vested interests in making sure that, in advocating for their communities, and in helping government see what it is, where the things that we just don't pay attention to, and that's the reality of it. When Sandy hit, and I was at HPD at this point, we were focused on inspections and demolitions and a whole lot of other, and housing, and figuring out where to put people who had to leave their homes. But we didn't necessarily get every community. There are some communities that we really only found out about after the storm, because these were communities where HPD just did not have feet on the ground. We didn't have programs in these neighborhoods, and we just weren't aware of them. Very soon into response, actually 3 days after the hurricane, I got a phone call from the president of a private foundation here in New York saying, "We're going to put money into long-term planning. What do you want to do with it? We're sure you're setting something up. What do you want to do with it?" And we started public-private partnerships immediately. You probably also remember that the Mayor's Fund collected about $60 million, and the Robin Hood Foundation actually was, I think, north of $80 million of money that was going to post-Sandy. Unfortunately, the vast majority of that money went to response. In fact, we kind of begged Robin Hood for the few $100,000 that they put to longer-term care. And we did convince the Mayor's Fund wisely to make a very large contribution to the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, particularly to help them bring on housing and financial counseling, both counselors as well as lawyers to staff up, as well as working with groups like LISC to help them bring on help CBOs that were in those communities, housing organizations who weren't necessarily working, say, in the Western Rockaways, but had been in Eastern Rockaway, to expand their capacity, also to bring on language capabilities. These were things. One of the great things about working with a nonprofit is they can staff up, assuming the money goes out, they can staff up very quickly, whereas government, as you know, sometimes it takes a bit longer to bring on your personnel or to redeploy. Certainly in emergency, it's all hands on deck, but as you start moving forward, it's helpful to have nonprofits there. The center also, I had worked with them, we actually, under the Bloomberg administration, the HPD with the City Council had actually created the Center for New York City Neighborhoods to deal with the mortgage foreclosure crisis. I don't know if you have paid attention, but there's almost a clear one-to-one overlap between the neighborhoods that were affected by the mortgage foreclosure crisis and the neighborhoods that were affected by Sandy. So a lot of these homeowners were, as we said, doubly underwater. They were underwater financially, and they were underwater from the storm. We could not have helped government, in the immediate aftermath, particularly because we did not know about the CDBG-DR funding. We didn't know when it was going to come online. And then when it was announced, we didn't know how much money we were going to have. We had to rely on nonprofits to do that work, to do the connecting with individual homeowners work that we just didn't have the capacity to do. When you don't know how much money, this is the way government funds, you have to have the money in place. And if you don't know how much money you have to rely on the people who do have it, and we were very lucky. Now, there is a sidebar to that, which is that large organizations that are well-established, that have the wherewithal, are in better situations to be able to handle those types of partnerships. But we did form umbrella groups, and those umbrella groups were able to support each other. So the housing counseling has continued until this day. We hope to soon be releasing a study that we did together with that the City Graduate Center has done for us, looking at people who are treated from our program, who dropped out of the program. One thing we know categorically is people who've stayed in with Build It Back, who have made it all the way through to completion. Majority of those, or statistically significant number of those people, was because they had housing counseling. Trying to figure out, as an individual homeowner who probably has never had any interaction with a government agency, how to navigate FEMA, how to navigate SBA, how to navigate CDBG-DR, all of those things, as well as trying to fend off the banks who want your mortgage payments, as well as dealing with all of the other things and everything else that was going on in your life. We know that the counseling works, and it can't be understated. And when we have been speaking with other jurisdictions, we've had a lot of calls from Houston, including after the forest fires in the fall, we had calls from California. We have told them repeatedly that they need to make sure that there is an investment in the nonprofits, but particularly in housing counseling. One of the other group I'd like to mention, not least because they're a sponsor of today's conference, is NIDUS. NIDUS was also brought in. They came on first as a sub with the center, particularly to deal with the type of housing, the type of needs that government funding could not support, either because the home wasn't, according to FEMA calculus, wasn't significantly damaged, and we needed to have additional money put to help those people through their NIDUS is part of the Unmet Needs Roundtable, which has been a huge help to a lot of homeowners who otherwise couldn't get help. We've also worked with NIDUS, as well as initially after the storm with Red Cross, on trying to help people who are undocumented Americans get support. And then things like temporary housing services. NIDUS is on this very interesting master lease program, which is much more makes it easier for a landlord in any of these communities to rent their home, to rent an apartment to a homeowner who needs to relocate temporarily due to construction. They've been able to do that in a way that government couldn't, and have really filled a critical gap that would have left homeowners really in the lurch, and I don't want to say homeless, but houseless, because in the temporary period they needed to between leaving a home for construction. I'm not going to go on, but one could go on about the criticality of the public-private partnerships. I will go to this a bit more later, but a piece of that as well is philanthropy, and I would like to talk about that when we talk about forward planning.
All right, thanks, Liz. Rich, you're going to talk to us about an 11-foot storm surge during Sandy.
Well, in my previous life, when I was a municipal employee, we have several wastewater treatment plants. One of them is Bay Park, which is in the southwestern shores of Nassau County. It was inundated with 11 feet of water, and actually the whole plant shut, because the plant was built in 1949, and no one had updated the systems inside the plant to make up for the new systems that were there, the new electrical systems and everything. They ran in the old tunnels. So when the plant flooded, all the electrical system flooded. All the pumps flooded, because they were not submersible, because when it was built, they used different technology. So we get this storm, the plant closes down. We were lucky in one factor, is that we were in the middle of negotiating a P3 for the operation of our stormwater and our sewer system. And we had some wherewithal with the group we were negotiating with, Suez Environment, who sent a group of tech people in to basically help us figure out how to get everything operating again. And we were operating in 2.5 days, moving the sewage back through the plant in 2.5 days. In that 2.5-day period, over 2,000 homes had sewage that backed up in it because the system became positive. So, our movement at that point was to try to relieve the pressure from the homeowner and get the sewage moving in a different direction. We actually pumped the sewage out at the low points into the bay. It was the only thing we could do other than have it keep backing up and have thousands of more homes inundated. But when we got the plant running and we had this extra bandwidth of forward-thinking engineering, we were able to make some adjustments, and we were treating in 10 days to permit. And I put a lot of that on the county employee, the hard work that everyone, but we also had hundreds of contractors, hundreds of engineers from firms who did work for us. And that's the only reason, really, that, if you look at that system and you go across the river to Passaic, they were down for 42 days in non-treatment. Just basically for 42 days, they were putting untreated effluent out into the water. So the use of that private entity to help you overcome some of the missing pieces that you have when you're a municipality because you're just worried about operating every day and keeping things working. You don't have the time to look forward or the wherewithal or bandwidth to make some of those decisions in your own process that someone else has made in 100 other plants. Or the group we were negotiating with operates 500 plants around the world. The experience they have was very different than the experience we have. And it made a great difference for us having that P3 partner with us during that time.
Thanks, Rich. Kevin, Rich has kind of bridged recovery and mitigation. Your responsibility is all phases.
Yes, thanks, Chuck, and thank you, everybody, for having us here today. And P3 partnerships and P3 initiatives, I think, are very key and important across all of the operations that we've heard about when it comes to response and recovery and mitigation efforts, as well as preparedness and planning. They really, as we continue to move into this new time of more and more natural disasters, more often, the potential for man-made disasters to happen every day at any minute, the partnerships that we start to build, I think, are paramount. I'd like to talk a little bit about just a preparedness initiative that I was involved in a few years ago, and it's really adding on to what Commissioner Perino was discussing when we talk about citizen preparedness. And when we really started to look at building resilient communities, back when the state rolled out their citizen preparedness initiative back in 2014, I was a county commissioner in charge of emergency planning and security and fire protection. One of the big initiatives that we then took it down to a local level and partnered with private entities is that citizen preparedness effort, really trying to get down to the core of our citizens, and not just the citizens themselves, but also building the community effort. What we were able to do at the time, I was also on the board of directors with the American Red Cross, and we leveraged the board members who all came from private entities and built off the state's program a local citizen preparedness initiative, including the not-for-profits, the faith-based organizations with those private entities, to build a program out to then go out to all of these organizations and provide citizen preparedness. The businesses, some of the bigger employers in the central New York area, were very key to then and very excited to take the program and bring it back to their own organizations. So they were bringing this program back within their employee base, which was huge. The commissioner articulated that we've trained about 250,000 people in the state of New York, and that's great. We've done a great program, and Kristen has stepped out. She and her team have done a wonderful job within DHSES building that program, but we all know we've got 19.7 million citizens in the state of New York, and it really is just a drop in the bucket. We all know also that each individual, although we talk about preparedness initiatives, each individual is not always capable of having food and water and materials available. Some communities are worried about their emergencies, what am I putting on the dinner table tonight? So it really needs to be that community effort and those organizations within that community. So building on a P3 initiative that we did really helped expand it, helped build it at the community level, but also leverage those businesses to also get the word out. And then that just exponentially grows as people bring it home to their employees. Challenges with a program like that is to keep it going, keep it motivated, keep it ongoing as people change, as people's roles change. I moved on to the state, started talking about that at the state level. And you need to have those champions that continue to keep those initiatives going. But it was clear right from the get-go, as that partnership was building, that everybody was excited to be working together, private entities, working with the government, working with the nonprofits, to build something that was going to be important and meaningful to individuals and to those communities in the times of disaster. And we'll talk about, as we move forward, things that we need to be thinking about as we continue to have vulnerabilities to more and more disasters, both natural and man-made.
Thanks, Kevin. Kudos to city and state for bringing attention to the whole P3 marketplace in January. They had a great summit here with awards. This marketplace is in its infancy, even though conceptually P3s have been around for a long time. Transcontinental Railroad is a P3 concept. The Erie Canal, a P3 concept. But now we've got a nation with tens of thousands of bridges and dams and all kinds of things that need to be replaced. And the only way that's going to happen is to open up this P3 marketplace, because it can bring innovators and new technology to get things done more cost effectively and, more importantly, in far less time. So I've asked the panel to think about their experiences and maybe share with us a particular vulnerability that they've seen that they think a P3 initiative would go a long way towards mitigating the risk of. And Ira, I'm going to hand this off to you. And I know you don't like the ball first on all these things, but you're in the hot seat because of your title.
There you go. I appreciate that. Thank you. So in thinking about this particular question, one of my biggest concerns in working with my colleagues across city government is the thousands of small businesses that we rely on across the city in every community to make sure that we can be resilient and that we can be prepared to recover from any kind of emergency. And those small businesses are focused on so many different challenges every single day. They're running their business. They're making sure they're worried about making their rent. They're worried about making payroll. They're worried about where their staff is and how they're gonna stay open. And so unfortunately, what we've seen in many conversations over the course of the years is that emergency preparedness for a small business isn't necessarily at the top of their agenda. It's not necessarily something they're focused on. And all too often, they when you talk to them about emergency preparedness, they right away start to think about, that's going to cost me a lot of money, and I don't know where to start. I don't want to invest in it, and they try to move on. And so I think that we've been having conversations in the city, at the national level, with our state partners over the years, about how do we find ways to incentivize and to make sure that small businesses are really thinking about these important issues, that really thinking about how do they save their sweat equity that they've put into building these businesses during an emergency. And so some of those ideas that have been floated over the years could be and potentially have resounding effects of looking at some industry partners like the insurance industry, really being able to show tangible benefits to reductions. We all know that if you buy a car and you have seat belts, you have an alarm. Depending on where you park, you can get reductions in your costs. And so perhaps there's a way, and we've had conversations with the insurance industry about finding ways to introduce some of those reductions so that small businesses can have a reason to develop a plan and then be able to show it to their insurance company and be able to get a reduction. Again, that's something that's going to have to be industry-wide and ultimately something to consider. The other potential incentive is for the banks and for the small business lenders, the folks who are putting their money out there to help these businesses start finding ways to encourage them to think about business continuity planning as part of their initial process, their initial steps in writing a business plan. Right now, I got my MBA here at Baruch, and when we were developing our business plan at the end of our project, our cumulative project, we didn't have a section in there talking about what happens if after all this investment that we've requested, that something happens and we're out of business for a bit of time. So what about making sure that some of those planning efforts include continuity concepts, so that when you're investing, if you're a bank or if you're a local development corporation and you're investing money into some of these small businesses, that you're going to be able to see a small business that's able to recover after an emergency and really pay off those loans that they're taking out now. So some of these concepts are ones that we can work on and develop and encourage some of the larger partners in the private sector to really, again, create those incentives and help our small businesses, which are really key to any recovery we would have across the city.
Thanks, Ira. And in what you've offered, brought up two other P3s, and I want to continue to beat this drum to this group. One of them is Thrive New York City, which teaches mental health first aid certification. And when Ira's talking about bringing back small businesses, in the study of disaster mental health, when we're focusing on the resilience of communities, what goes a long way to communities coming back is those small businesses, those bodegas, those operations that can't survive more than 2 weeks out of business, but are critical in a community where if people can go and get a cup of coffee, a paper, a pack of cigarettes, whatever their thing is that gets them back into their rhythms, goes a long way to getting them back to feeling like there's hope and that their community can survive this. I also want to mention another P3, and Ira and I are both on the board of it, and that's a P3 between the New York City Department of Education and the Urban Assembly. And we serve on the board of the Urban Assembly School of Emergency Management here in New York, which is the nation's first emergency management high school. So smaller P3s getting a lot done. Liz?
Picking up on where Ira left off, I think this culture of preparedness is what we've been calling it, is critical in every walk of life. I would say, and I'll take it up a sort of level, but certainly organizational preparedness within the nonprofit sector is critical. A study that was done 1 year, there were a lot of, I'm sure you've seen them, there were a lot of 1 year after Sandy reports. One of them was done actually by Jack Krauskopf here at Baruch, together with the Human Services Council, and this is a year out of Sandy. 50% of organizations that he surveyed had disaster management or recovery plans in place, and fewer than 20% of organizations had set aside contingency funds for their own operations. I would imagine that if that was 1 year after Sandy, that 4.5 more years down the pike, those funds have either diminished down to zero, and those those plans and plan preparedness were either on shelves or they got lost when there was a change of executive director. So I think that's upon all of us to take that on. I think, though, that this speaks to taking this up a larger level, which to my mind, the vulnerability is just much more broadly staying engaged during what's called blue skies. How do you make sure that people actually care about this issue when it's nice weather outside and when there is no storm in the offing and or no sense of the next, attack on the city? I kid you not, I read in one of the real estate blogs that I don't know if it was Real Estate Weekly or The Real Deal or something, where a broker in Howard Beach talking about how the community has come back said, people are buying again in Howard Beach and Broad Channel because, those storms only happen once every 100 years. And I was like, well, that's one way to look at it. So there are people who should know better, who don't know better, and I think this making sure that everybody knows maintains a level of engagement. This doesn't mean you have to have weekly meetings about these things. Certainly within the city government, we work with OEM regularly. We work with a whole lot of other agencies. But there is a really critical need to maintain institutional knowledge. And since I began my comments in the last question about pointing out that nonprofits are in for the long term, I want to reiterate that nonprofits are the groups that are there for future disasters. These are the groups who are there in between mayoral, gubernatorial, federal administrations. They're the ones who have the long picture view of what goes on in communities, and they need to stay engaged, and we need to maintain the public-private linkages with government so that neither of us is necessarily going down some avenue without making sure that the other one knows what's going on. Even the most basic thing is just making sure that your email trees, your phone trees, everything else like that are updated so that you know who to reach out to when something happens. To that end, I said I would talk about philanthropy. One of the problem that we faced right after Sandy, and we continue to face now, is that philanthropy sort of comes in and out of these issues and is interested. Right after Sandy, I represented HPD on something called the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, which raises money in each locality around that particular disaster and then gives it out. And then they move to the next disaster, and then the next disaster. And certainly Philanthropy New York, which is the umbrella group for foundations in the New York tri-state area, they did a lot of year after reports, but they're still not necessarily engaged. I know the people there, but I don't know that they've actually thought about these things for the long term in terms of just making sure that when a foundation officer is looking at the annual report for the groups that they fund, that they actually in the course of that say, listen, just want to make sure you've been putting aside for a rainy day, you've been thinking about what your organizational plans are. And then there are some very real needs which need to be funded. So blue skies, cultural preparedness, we have real issues around flood mitigation, about making sure that homeowners, not homeowners who necessarily came through post-Sandy programs, but just all of them, that they understand what they can be doing to mitigate risk in the future. The Center for New York City Neighborhoods, for example, received money from the state to do flood audits in particular city councilman districts, which are great, but then you hand a list of possible things that you could do to make flood-proof your house, and there's no financing available because there are no small grants available. We should be talking with foundations about how do you build some type of grant pool, maybe some type of forgivable loan or a revolving loan from some type of cash enhancement, credit enhancement that you've been describing on the bank side that would work in tandem with your mortgage in some way. This increases not just the value of your home, but it actually is going to decrease, ultimately, government's need to invest in future storm recovery. Similarly, while the nonprofits that we work with certainly know about the implications of the National Flood Insurance Program in terms of the obligation to maintain flood insurance for the life of the home, not the ownership of the home, but the life of the home. Many of our homeowners, even though we have it printed all over everything, and when they sign all of their forms, they agree to it, they don't remember. Brokers don't necessarily know to pay attention to those things when a home transaction takes place. We need to make sure, and we need public-private partnerships, as well as funding to make sure that we can do the program development, the education and outreach and implementation over the next long while to make sure that people stay on top of these things. Because the next storm will not happen in the next 100 years. It will happen sooner than that. And we need to make sure that we have these partnerships, right, knock on wood, that we need to make sure that these partnerships are ongoing to prevent future problems with our constituents.
Thanks, Liz. Now, Rich is going to talk to us about a fascinating innovation in debris removal that, because of municipal policy, cannot be enacted. Rich?
To the sexy part of the recovery, everyone likes to pick up the debris, right, the vegetation and the construction debris from when someone mucks someone's house out. One of the issues I see in this realm, in this field, where I think housing sits separately, I think inside the FEMA DR program, that a true P3 is very difficult to manage because of the rules inside the DR handbook, which FEMA lives and dies by. Anytime there's a moment where you're using someone not as a contractor, but as a private partner, there are rules that occur inside about revenue back to the private partner. There's moments where you could recover items. In our recovery in Sandy, we had an entire beach parking lot filled with home debris, including white goods, which are refrigerators and washing machines and everything else. And because of the rules inside the DR, we had to dispose of the white goods as a hazardous material. Now, the federal government paid us for that, but there was an alternative that could have occurred. You could have harvested the materials that were not hazardous and then scrapped it. But because of the rules, that scrap would then be deducted from the municipality's recovery dollars. So anytime you have a vehicle that gets swamped, you decide that it's no good, FEMA's inspector comes in and says, we agree it's no good, you dispose of it and you get $3,000 for it, that $3,000 comes off of your recovery. So when you bring a true P3 partner in, their motivation is a revenue system that they can extract from for their business, other than in housing where you get a lot of the church groups and assist groups that come out and they do it out of the good of their heart and they do it out of their own funding. But inside the recovery section, right now in California, there's a group that has a system that you can take this charred wood, burned wood, half-burned wood, vegetation, and turn it into energy, gasification. Well, the state of California can't let them do it because then they have to calculate what the worth of the gas was and deduct it from the recovery of each of those individual municipalities. So it's very convoluted and needs to kind of be addressed at the federal level as to why wouldn't you want a green solution to 1,000 cubic yards of vegetation rather than sticking in a landfill. If there's an alternate system you can do to create energy or to become a byproduct, they should allow the municipality to look at that and have the ability to use that moment to create the revenue that a true P3 needs. A true P3 needs some sort of revenue cash. I've done 3 of them. I did one in transportation. We privatized our bus operations. The company that took over the bus operations has to make money. We did it in the Nassau Veterans Coliseum. We got it paid for, reconditioned by an outside vendor, but there had to be a revenue stream for them to actually perform that task and be able to take their investment out and pay for their work. And then we did the wastewater system. In the same situation, the wastewater system operator has to make a profit. They're a company that has to make money. So a true P3 is a tough fit in this realm, where the private partnership of philanthropy and fundraisers and people who come in church groups is a really good fit in areas, but because of the rules, it doesn't help the municipality fit in on the, getting people's roads open back up, getting their drainage open back up. Now, previous to the storm, a true P3 is a fantastic thing. If you can get someone to take your stormwater system and they can create a revenue service out of it, they do the upgrades. They pay for the upgrades. The municipality doesn't have to. So pre-storm and post-advice, I think the P3 is an excellent avenue. But inside the storm, the section where you have to pick up the debris, you have to fix the pumps, and it doesn't have a great fit. And it's kind of because the rules are so arcane inside FEMA's recovery world. The book was written, 35 years ago, and hasn't really had a lot of amendments. The only thing they've done recently, and it was for Sandy, is they created a program called the 428 program, which means you could take a bunch of problems you had in one area and consolidate it into one PW, one public access sheet that you work on, and it becomes one unit versus having 3,000 sheets that you have to work on and close out every single time. It becomes one. And that was a big step for FEMA to turn around and do that in the actual debris monitoring as well as mitigation in the 404 and 406 world. So I just think it's a different fit.
I want to ask you a question, Rich. Because of this poor policy on FEMA's part, in their DR manual and the way that they're implementing this, the municipalities disincentivized from doing something that's environmentally responsible.
Absolutely.
Okay, so as a result of that, what did you end up doing with all the debris?
We carted it off to Ohio at $170 a cubic yard and dropped it in a hole in the ground.
Now, how many trucks would you guess that was going from Nassau to Ohio?
I would say daily,
Yeah.
300 trucks a day taking construction debris and probably 120 trucks a day taking vegetative debris. Just think about the minimization of greenhouse gas emissions that occurs if you can find an alternate system that the municipality doesn't get penalized on. If you can do that, just truck traffic over your bridges, running your infrastructure, it's kind of crazy to think that they wouldn't have a forward thought and say, yeah, what can you do with that where you are? And we'll let you do that. But it's not the municipality doesn't have any incentive to do it because the day that the first tree hits the ground, you already have a pre-planned contract out. And it says, you pick up 1 cubic yard of this, it goes in this style truck, you take a picture of it, it goes to your transfer station, your dump, it goes there, it gets reduced, you pick it up again, and you truck it to wherever its final destination is, and they pay you for that entire piece. It's called the cradle to grave disposal. So you pick it up, and you put it where it belongs, and they pay you X number of dollars for each cubic yard of that, rather than thinking forward and saying, look, there are systems. You could bring it to a cogen plant and create energy out of it, but you can't because they don't let you, because then it becomes a problem. You have to do so much paperwork to try to figure out what your deduction of that revenue stream is. It's not worth it because they're going to pay you to just dump it in the ground. So that's what municipalities do. They'll just dump it in the ground.
All right. So to quote a Jack Nicholson character, go sell crazy somewhere else. We're all stocked up here. Kevin, where is the need?
The need is, I think, as we've heard and we've talked about a lot on this panel today, referring a lot to Sandy, one singular event that impacted a large population base in New Jersey and New York and other areas. The need for us to continue to partner is never more clear than watching the 2017 hurricane season, the catastrophic effects that it had on our country, on the Caribbean, and the ongoing impacts that it's going to have well into the future, decades from now, especially down in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And the need for P3 initiatives is so important because as you think about these types of events, they continue to grow. We continue to have more of them. And we always have that threat of the man-made disaster. Fires are not going away. Accidents are not going away. Hazardous materials aren't going to go away. Earthquakes, volcanoes, tornadoes, those things are not going to go away. Strong, severe thunderstorms are not going to go away. Flash flooding is not going to go away. We have flash flooding warnings down here. But those things seem to be happening more frequently, and as we continue to, and we could spend a lot of time debating climate change and what that's going to do. The reality is things are changing, and we still have that everyday threat of man-made disasters. P3 partnerships, I think, are going to help it. As you think about the 2017 season impacting multiple states with the hurricanes, but then also having historic wildfires going on in the upper Northwest, resources are stretched. Resources are stretched beyond people's capacities, even beyond capabilities. And P3 initiatives really come into play. Governor Cuomo in New York State going through a large donation collection initiative for Puerto Rico. It was clear that we needed private sector partnerships in order to get those goods and those commodities to the people that really needed them. And they stepped up and they were very supportive. During Sandy, we had great support from organizations like Walmart, who sent an executive to the New York State EOC and spent the entire time. There was always somebody rotating out from the executive level, being able to support any requests, be able to move commodities from their stores that are without power. That executive had the authority to be able to donate goods and resources. So those partnerships need to continue to grow because we're going to continue to have these disasters. I hate to be the, Commissioner Perino calls me the master of disaster at times. It seems like I always just get to talk about all the bad things that happen in the state of New York. But that's the reality. And while all those things are going, I did a talk a few weeks ago at the Homeland Security Conference here in New York City, where we talked about the evolution of emergency management and where it's going, and to think about the evolution from the 1930s when we wrote the Flood Control Act, as we had, as a government entity, as the United States identified a problem. Then we got into civil defense in the 50s, and that rolled into Cold War era and nuclear preparedness and nuclear activity. Then we have an accident at 3 Mile Island, leading to all those things leading up to the formation of FEMA. We continue to evolve and continue to find new ways to deal with problems, and the private sector, I think, is going to be an important component of that. Because while we think about all these things that are happening that are going to continue to happen and how we do these on multiple fronts at the same time, think about while we had that hurricane season, had Jose made its way up and made a direct impact on Long Island during that same time frame, we would have had more catastrophic efforts with resources already stretched thin, spread out across the country. So those potentials are there that we have to watch out for. And then you think about the future and what that holds. I know you've talked about cyber incidents and the advent of cybersecurity and all the things that we're hearing about in the news today. But what could that potentially do to the electric grid? What could that potentially do to businesses and banking and the like? The advent of artificial intelligence and robotics and facial recognition software and how that all plays into all of what we do are just more things that we have to be involved in and think about what are the exposures of that, even though they're being brought in as some of the technology as good things. So it's important that we work together and develop more P3. Chuck had mentioned that really public-private partnerships have been around a long time. But now to start to really formalize and put those together, I think is important. We continue to work on that at the state level, working with the city of New York and working with our partners around the state to ensure that we bring in those private entities and have them involved in what we do as far as emergency planning and preparedness. Because that is the future. That is, what we need to be thinking about going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. Is it totally inappropriate to ask for questions this late in the afternoon? Afraid of crowd violence if you're the one person that brings up a question, no?
Okay. It
We're
is-
not going to take it personally, right?
It's-
Okay. Panel, oh, yes.
Okay, I'm Rebecca. So we're doing research on food, energy, and water and how we prepare for infrastructure to be more resilient. So how do you manage that with the response efforts? So that you don't have to have the infrastructure, the future infrastructure less vulnerable.
All right. Did everyone hear the question? Repeat the question. So in terms of food and water and the infrastructure for being able to survive disasters, how does a P3 initiative help to strengthen that infrastructure? So I'll hit the ball first. If you look around the city right now, let's say you drive by LaGuardia Airport, okay? That's a huge piece of infrastructure, and that is a P3 initiative between the Port Authority and an outside innovator. If you've traveled over the Goethals Bridge, okay, that's a bridge that should have been decommissioned a long time ago. It was designed to handle 75,000 people a day, okay? It handles, I think, around 600,000 people a day. And the Port Authority created a P3 with a consortium, and they built a beautiful new bridge that just opened. It has room for expansion. It has a pedestrian walkway. And the whole time, the old bridge was functioning. And this P3, I believe they're going to be paying the consortium around $56 million a year for the next 40 years. And they're really happy that they did it because they got a beautiful bridge that's expandable, and they got it in record time. So these are just a few things.
I want to address food, because he's talking about bridges, you're talking about food. So the city of New York, this has come up particularly around Hunts Point, right? Around the protecting Hunts Point and making sure that we are not faced with, that, for those who don't know, I mean, Hunts Point flooded in around the edges, but otherwise we were very lucky that it wasn't cut off and our food supply wasn't cut off. There have been, so I can't speak to what OEM or to what other infrastructure agencies are doing. I can speak to the Rebuild by Design program, which was sponsored actually by my former commissioner, Sean Donovan, when he was at HUD, which was an international design competition. One of the projects they ended up selecting for their long-term design process is the Hunts Point, I don't even know what the full title is, but it's a mitigation project to particularly protect the city's food sources during storm. That includes a whole lot of, besides just the infrastructure work, it also includes figuring out the partnerships both through the different vendors that use Hunts Point, but also critically with the nonprofit organizations that are working in and around that community as well. Just putting together the proposal was in itself a public-private partnership, so the money was a separate allocation of CDBG-DR funding that came from HUD. That was interesting. I mean, this was part of Sean's, the hallmark when he was at HUD and also when he was at HPD in terms of coming up with sort of contests as a way to put the private sector to tap into the imagination and the work of the private sector, whether it's the nonprofit sector or the corporate sector, to come up with ideas to address public issues. And so this project is going to be taking that on. I don't know, it's still being run out of the HUD office here in New York. I don't know the status of the implementation of it, but the money is there, it has been allocated, and it is safe for implementation. I do know that this is part of some also larger community planning work that's going on in that particular part of the city.
Thanks. Kevin, you've got a question.
Yes, how do you distinguish between P3s and privatization? That's a good question. And obviously privatization of some projects, some infrastructure projects, I think is also a very important aspect of this. But P3, initiatives, working with government and working with your local entities, whether it be the state or the city or the county or the town, I think is, that partnership where you, working on an initiative, whether it's emergency preparedness or a specific recovery effort, that you can come together with both resources. There are other projects out there that would be best suited for privatization and be able to, they might have the resources and the means to do that with the proper funding. But I differentiate those two things by the work that we're doing, the projects that we're doing, and it's, when I look at it for the common good and what's going to be best for the community.
Thanks, Kevin. I think, Ira, we've got one more minute for your final question.
Oh, great. So, this is a loaded question, but so are there conflicts of interest working with P3s? And what incentives do private companies have besides getting a contract with a government agency? Great questions, and something that we are often challenged with is really finding a way to sell these partnerships to our private sector partners. The reality is, unfortunately, for many of our private sector partners, they love to ride in on a white horse, and so partnering in advance and having conversations in advance can only at times be challenging. But for us, the goal is to really make sure that a true partnership has a benefit for both. The resiliency, the support, and the partnership of these organizations really make sure that they can support their employees, they can support their business, they can be able to recover as quickly as possible, and ultimately make sure that they are relevant and useful to their industry. So many of our partners really come, especially many of our private sector partners really come to do good. They want to support their community. They're interested in being a part of the solution. But ultimately, for us, a lot of it is making sure that we get out of the way. And specifically from an emergency management perspective, we're not looking to do contracts. We're looking to make sure that we can facilitate the flow of information and flow of resources to the right in the right way, but without paying for those contracts.
All right, and in the spirit of punishment, we have one final question.
Well, just one comment on Ira's, in terms of conflict of interest. I mean, these are contractual things, right? You procure, so there's a transparent process. It's not as if we go around the community and we say, you duck, duck, goose, you're the ones we're picking. So there is a transparent process to this. Part of this also is just trying to get as many people involved. I mean, not everybody involved, but trying to get as many people involved as possible so that there are more people that we can work with. The more people that care about this issue, the better for all of us. This one is quick. With regards, I made a comment about the Hunts Point project. Does that include Fresh Direct? I don't know. Because I'm not the point person on this project, but I can refer you to Rebuild by Design. The projects are all online. If you Google Rebuild by Design, you can look for the proposal, and I will tell you who the partners are on that.
Can we have a round of applause for this great panel? Thank you.
Do you want us to stand up? Or?
Great, thank you all.